In an earlier video on mental relativity and the brain, I described 4 aspects of the physiology of the brain that give rise to the mind, according to mental relativity theory. They are the overall brain neurology, the overall brain biochemistry, the individual neurologies of each individual ganglion, and the microclimate zone biochemistries of each individual ganglion. Collectively, the ganglia operate at a different level because they are aspects or facets of an overall brain neurology and an overall brain biochemistry. It's almost like a magnitude of difference between the two. In order for the mind to exist, according to mental relativity theory, we need 2 different magnitudes of operating system. We need one overall, and we need within it smaller ones that act like parallel processors within a larger processor. In addition, we need the biochemistry and the neurology, essentially the binary of the neurology and the analog of the biochemistry. When you take the analog and the binary and you create a 2 magnitude level operating system, it will come together to create in the brain what we call the mind, which exists, in fact, as a very complex undulating interference pattern of the relative impact of each of these 4 areas of physiology constantly, one upon all the other 3. In that way, they are all existing in a relative fashion because they're continually interrelating and changing each other, hence the name mental relativity. Well, now it's time to look at the mind itself and to divide it into its 4 component areas of process. Different kinds of processes that go on in the mind as opposed to different kinds of physiology in the brain. It is the physiology of the brain that gives rise, in almost a fractal sense, to the dynamics and processes of the mind, which reflect the same kinds of relationships. The mind is a machine made of time. It must be in motion to exist. The mind does not exist in the physical world, but is a result of the physical world. So taking all this together, think back to a time when you drifted away on some mental tangent until you suddenly were jolted back to reality and you realized that several minutes had passed unnoticed. Well, during that lost period, your mind simply did not exist, for it had ceased to be in motion. The moment some external stimulus triggered a response, however, the physical nature of the 4 aspects of the brain recreated your mind more or less as it was when it ceased, like a self-starting motor. More precisely, it was not your whole mind that ceased to exist in the example, but rather it was that quality of the mind called self-awareness. In fact, these 4 areas of the mind are related very much as the 4 areas of the brain. They are the conscious, memory, subconscious, and preconscious. Self-awareness is the synthesis of all 4 areas of the mind working together and interacting and affecting one another. The 4 areas of the mind are not as simple as those 4 aspects of the brain. Each aspect of the brain has its unique kind of process and is also influenced in unique ways by the processes of the other 3, the biochemistry and the neurology at a high level and at a lower level. In a sense, each aspect of the brain has its own memory, which consists of the state it's in at any given moment, for that's indicative of all that's happened up to that moment. Also, each aspect of the brain has its own subconscious, for that indicates the direction or iteration of the process. Each aspect of the brain has a preconscious that indicates the momentum or inertia of the process. And each has a consciousness, which is its response to the collective influence of the other 3. So if we look at the neurology, it has consciousness, memory, subconscious, preconscious. If we look at the whole brain biochemistry, it also has consciousness, memory, subconscious, preconscious. In other words, 1/4 of each of those 4 aspects of the brain deals with memory for each, and 1/4 of each deals with consciousness. and 1/4 deals with subconscious, and 1/4 deals with preconscious. When all four aspects of the brain are acting in concert together, then the mind groups the aspect that's memory out of each one and creates memory in the mind. It pulls together consciousness out of each one and has conscious, which is awareness, not self-awareness, but just awareness, consciousness, which comes 1/4 from each of the four aspects of the brain, conceptually. We're not talking about dividing it up slice and dice like coring an apple or something. Similarly, preconscious, similarly, subconscious, all of them have 1/4 of the influence that creates them, another way of looking at it, is in each of the four aspects of the brain. And collectively, when all four aspects of the brain interact and create a complex interference pattern, the mind is the grouping of that 1/4 influence into four separate patterns of the mind. So it's kind of like one of those origami flowers that opens up on itself. It's not just a one-to-one correlation. It's actually pulling 1/4 pieces to create a single whole and then a second fourth to create another whole. And you end up with memory and consciousness, subconsciousness, and preconsciousness out of those four aspects of the brain. Each aspect has a hand in the others. So, even with all this complexity, for a machine made of time, this description sounds rather static. Because the mind is so complex, this doesn't sound sufficient. And that's because we've described the processes of the mind as objects like consciousness and subconsciousness and memory and so on. Standing waves that represent an interference pattern caused by dissimilar systems, each interacting in a larger system, ganglia and the whole brain, biochemistry and neurology, hierarchy. There's also a progressive nature, however, to the mind as it evolves, changes, learns, and adapts. Understanding this requires a different side of the mental relativity model and makes the understanding of the mind appear much less static. Let's think of a serial neuron as an empty pipe that could hold 10 billiard balls from one end of the pipe down to the other. Every time this neuron is stimulated, it receives one more billiard ball, and eventually the pipe would become filled to its capacity of 10. Well, if one more stimulation occurs, the new billiard ball would enter the pipe at the top, and one at the other end would pop out. This is kind of a model of the binary aspect of the mind, the way a neuron fires. Now add to this model that the pipe is made of rubber and is coated on the inside with oil. If this pipe had only one billiard ball in it, it might take a whole day to go through, but eventually the billiard ball would slide out the bottom even without any additional stimulation from above. So you don't need 10 billiard balls under that case and have 11th to pop one out of the bottom. One ball will slide through because of the friction coating of the oil. If 2 billiard balls are present, the combined weight might make it drop out in only half a day. And with the maximum capacity of 10 billiard balls, it might take only a few minutes to pop through. In other words, even without additional stimulation, this model of a neuron would spontaneously shed itself of its built-up potential. Now, how quickly this would happen depends on the degree of previous stimulation. If there's a lot, it's going to shed quickly. If it doesn't have much, it might take a little longer. That's why the buildup of balls will make it go through more quickly. We see this in real neurons in the real brain, that if the action potential does not reach a point of firing, then the neuron eventually will simply have a half-life, and that level of potential will degrade, will dissipate, until it's back to zero potential. But where does that material go? Where does that energy or that potential go? Where does the action potential dissipate to? Well, in this model, let's add a temperature control to the room in which the pipe hangs. Now, when the room is hotter, the oil in the pipe is thinner and the billiard balls pop out more quickly. When the room is colder, the oil is thicker and the billiard balls take longer to fall through. What if the temperature in the room was controlled by the frequency at which the new balls were added to the pipe? More balls equals a hotter temperature, fewer balls a lower temperature. So in this case, the greater the stimulation, the greater the speed of the bulbs through the pipe. But even if the stimulation stops for a while, it takes time for the room to cool down. So even if the pipe is currently empty, but the room is still hot, a single ball of stimulation will slide right through, making it more sensitive to stimulation because of previous stimulation. This intensity of previous stimulation is remembered, quote unquote, by the temperature of the room and creates a learned pathway through the pipe that favors experience at the expense of accurate reproduction of observation. This is, in truth, more than a model of a neuron. It's a simple model of the basic relationship between neurology and biochemistry. Why? Because the biochemistry is where the energy from the action potential dissipates when the action potential is not used, is not triggered, rather than being sent on through the neurology to other neurons. Instead, all of those potassium ions, all of the neurotransmitters that are involved in this, simply dissipate out that created the action potential in the first place into the surrounding biochemistry to affect the environment the same way temperature would affect this greased pipe, rubber pipe, in the room. Now imagine there's many pipes in the room. The output from the first pipe falls into a second pipe, kaboom, kaboom, and the second pipe's output falls into a third, down the line. Now imagine that each pipe has a funnel at the top and a sprayer at the bottom, so that a single pipe's input might come from several other pipes, and its output might go to several. Add to this a second kind of billiard ball that lowers the room temperature instead of raising it, like neurotransmitters that are exciters or inhibitors. We'll add those into our equation. Put this whole model together and you get a very complex synthesis indeed, one which is recursive, self-sustaining, patterns become possible, one in which ripples of force might occur. In such a system, standing wave patterns might occur and be relatively stable in the short run, yet change over time. And in addition, a single pattern might hold its integrity, yet not be anchored in one place, so that pattern would move from one set of neurons to another. Such a pattern of standing waves might flow through the system, reflect off the sides, invert or collide with another pattern, and when the standing waves remain anchored in one place, consideration is not occurring, and self-awareness will cease to exist. But when the standing wave patterns are in motion, the mind being a machine made of time, consideration is occurring, and self-awareness does exist. So clearly from this, or maybe not so clearly, but from this simple analogy, a very complex model can be derived that on the surface reflects the observable dynamics of the human mind, the observable dynamics of the human brain, and this model is developed in much greater detail in a future video that we're going to do on mental relativity and psychology. But that's enough to whet your appetite to show how neurology, biochemistry, neural networks, large and small ones operating within the larger one, each having a biochemistry, each interacting in 4 different ways, and collectively pieces of each or influences from each going to make up our memory, consciousness, our subconscious, and our preconscious, essentially how the mind is created from the physiology of the brain, as predicted conceptually by a theory of mental relativity, which came from the theory of dramatica. I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story and the mental relativity theory of mind, and I hope you will explore some of our other articles and videos at dramaticapedia.com.